Okay, morning everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for getting out of bed and all that. At least it's a lovely sunny morning. I'm going to talk about Taliban Christianity, but really about the rise of Christian nationalism and some theory about the background to church and state and so on. So I'm going to start off by telling you a little story. I've 10, 15 years ago, I talked a bit on church and state and stuff, and I used this book quite extensively. It's a book by Charles Colson, Kingdoms in Conflict. It's a very good book. Charles Colson was Nixon's lawyer. He wasn't a Christian at the time. Got put in Chucky. He was very, very, very bright guy. Sort of wiggled himself up to right next to Nixon, and but he took one of the falls and he went to prison. And in prison, he got converted. He's written a book about that. And then he started Prison Fellowship International, something like that, where he's started this NGO which does a whole lot of good work in prisons internationally. And he's probably dead now. But I have drawn on this book quite a lot. And when I talked previously, that's why I've got so many little notes in it. I quoted from it quite a lot. But I'm going to start with telling you a story that he tells at the beginning of this book, and I'll tell you why. And then I'm going to go on to talk about church and state and some theory behind that, and Augustine of Hippo. And then go into the US take on the separation of church and state, the United States, and then the rise of Christian nationalism in the USA, and what is it? And then what fruit do we see in terms of the administration in the US, without going on a long diatribe, but just a little diatribe? And what fruit do we see in Trump himself? And then our response to this, as both as a church and as an individual. So I've got to move on quite swiftly. Let's start with the story. And this book was written in 1987, and he sets this story soon after that, and it's in the context of there's been this whole battle between the Christian New Right in the US, which was a sort of reaction, although it had longer roots, but it's a reaction to the 60s and the 70s and liberalism and the feeling that Christianity should be privatized, keep it in the closet just for you. And then we got the rise of the moral majority and the Christian New Right and all that. And so sort of reclaiming that Christian space. But there was a lot of Christian nationalism in that movement. And so we now have a president in the United States is a big, strong, handsome, manly guy. He's come into power on the back of, I'm going to bring religion back and Christ back into the government, and he's a clean living guy, and he gets caught up in something happening in the Middle East. They get intelligence. It starts off with him playing squash at 6 o'clock in the morning before he goes to office, and he's called off the squash court. He's beating a guy 15 years his junior, so he's very pleased by that. And he gets called off the court to go to the Situation Room in the White House, and the intelligence comes that there's a far-right group in Israel which has done a deal with the main Likud party or whatever it was in Israel, and because they needed power, just like Netanyahu needs power now, and they want to invade and take over the Dome of the Mosque on the Temple Mount. Right, the Dome of the Mosque, as you know, is a Muslim mosque now. It started on the temple, the second temple built in 500 BC after the chaps came back from Babylon, and then updated by Herod. And so all the advisors and to the president realized this is Houston, because if you take out the Dome of the Rock, it's going to trigger some kind of massive Middle East crisis and potentially escalate from there. But the president goes into his Old Testament theology and thinks, well, can I really get on with this? Because what should I do? Because this could be a sign of the end times. And here is the reestablishment of Israel, and they're taking over the dome, and this is the sort of one of the stages in the sign of the end times. And I mustn't interfere with God's agenda. So I'm just going to read you a little paragraph from that, and then carry on with the story. So now he's sitting in his room with his chief advisor, his chief of staff, who's his closest confidant, who doesn't share his worldview, and he's prevaricating because the generals and everything have sent the aircraft carrier in, and yeah, well done, thanks. And they've got the Marines on standby in the Med, and they're ready to go, and on his command, and prevent this happening. Basically, take on Israel, the Israeli government, and stop this happening because they realize the danger thereof. And so he's sitting he's in his office, and his chief advisor is talking to him. The advisor, who's Parish, says, "You're responsible for 100 millions of lives, including mine. And you seem to be guiding us by some obscure kooky theory about the end of the world." And then the president says, "What if obscure kooky theory happens to be true?" And the advisor says, "Look, I'm happy to leave that decision up to God. The end of the world is his business. Our business here in the White House is to prevent the end of the world." "Well, according to my theology, Larry," says the president, "the end of the world." Parish interrupted, something he never would have done had he not been deeply distressed. "Your theology is irrelevant right now. You weren't elected to be the nation's theologian." Hopkins, which is the name of the president, was visibly shocked by his aide's words. He turned and walked over to the window and looked out across the south lawn at the Washington Monument, floodlit against the darkened sky. "Larry, I remember what you said. Larry, you remember what I said in the campaign. America needs a president who will speak for God as well as for the American people. The people voted for me and for that. So maybe in a sense they did elect me as their theologian." "You know better than that, sir. Not 5% of them know what the word theology means. They elected you because you were moral and upright, have one wife, nice kids, and speak soothingly on TV. And they were fed up to here with anti-family, anti-God. Those are all the woke stuff, right? They were fed up to here with anti-family, anti-God, anti-everything except the orca whale. So they decided to trust you, Shelby," and that's the president's first name. Parish had never before called the president by his first name. "They trust you. You can't betray them. But and then he says, but I only avoid that if I keep trust with God." Then Parish, the advisor, says, "Then keep us out of the war. Surely God did not put you here to cheer on the Israelis while they blunder into World War III. Hartwell, that's the Minister of Defense, has informed that this right-wing group in Tzura, they call it, and Orange, who is the president Prime Minister or President of Israel, have reached an agreement. If we don't stop them with our Marines, they'll destroy the mosque, possibly within the next 24 hours. We have to move militarily or there'll be no war, or there'll be a war." "No," Hopkins said vehemently, "I will not lift a hand against God's chosen people." And so the story develops. And it gets to a point where he hesitates and prevaricates, and Orange won't respond to him. That's the president of Israel. They're trying to get the ambassador to talk to him, and Orange is blocking the ambassador. And then as they prevaricate, boom, they do it, all right? And the Dome of the Rock goes up in smoke. They've had intelligence also that the Russian army has been because this stuff went public because one of the guys leaked it to the press. So while it's all happening, the press was on it. And then they've got intelligence that the Russians are mobilizing, but he doesn't worry about that because in the Bible, the armies are going to come out of the north, and he interprets that as the Russians. And anyway, when it all and the story ends there. Now what? You know? So and it's I just want you to keep that as background in your head as I go forward. So now I'm going to go on to church and state. And Augustine of Hippo, who lived from 350 to 430. So he lived at the time that the Nicene Creed had just been done, and it was ratified again in 375 or 380 or something like that. So, but he's a very strong intellect, And he didn't only comment on church and state, it was also on the Trinity and all sorts of things. Very powerful. He's also the patron saint of brewers, beer, all right? So I don't know if that gave him his intelligence, but I feel better when I have another beer these days, right? And he came up with this concept, the city of man and the city of God. And he says that, and he's biblical about this, but we are between the two stages of the kingdom. We're now not yet. And he says God has ordained three structures to keep the world contained, if you like. And one is the family, which I'm not going to talk about now, but the family is the primary building block for propagation, obviously, for developing humanism and acceptance of some sort of authority, and the development of conscience and morality in people. It's obviously implanted there in the image of God and DNA and all that, but you've still got to nurture it. And so then we come to the state, which he says is ordained by God, but it's God's response to the nature of people and the need to contain chaos. We can deal with a lot of stuff, but people can't deal with chaos. So it's not a tool. The state is not a tool to establish the kingdom of God, but to set boundaries for human behavior. It's not a remedy for sin, but a means to contain it. So the city of man, or the state, is there to maintain law and order, restrain evil, promote justice, protect the vulnerable, promote liberty and security, and develop the conditions for people to prosper. And obviously in South Africa, for example, these Chapter 9 institutions, there's the restraints on power are built into our constitution. We have the judiciary, we have the constitution, we have civil society, we have the fourth estate being the press, we have parliament, and we have various Chapter 9 institutions. So they're all sort of constraints on power. And also, Augustine says that the rule of law, which the state has to execute, is in the Judeo-Christian world, it's a function of transcendent moral absolutes. It's not just a construct of the powerful. You know, the more powerful beat up the less powerful and say the law is my way. And it's not that kind of a bargain or on the whims of fashion. It has a scriptural basis. It has it's based in the moral absolutes of God. Then we get to the city of God, or the church. And what is the purpose of the church? It's to proclaim the kingdom. It's to preach the gospel. It's to model compassion. It's to witness the values of the kingdom and deal with social justice and talk out on social justice. That's not exhaustive, but it's inter alia. Just as an aside, when I said model compassion, I've got a note here. One of the things I read in developing this was one of the quotes of Elon Musk, who says the greatest weakness of Western civilization is empathy, right? If both of these, city of man and city of God, fail in their appointed tasks, that being the church being the visible manifestation of the kingdom of God, and the state being there to maintain justice and concord, then civic order collapses, and the healthy tension between the two collapses. So, but both the city of God and city of man demand allegiance in their different ways. And the city of God demands allegiance to God. The state is about power. I mean, government is about power, and so you can say power is the mother's milk of politics. Business, it's power and money. And you can see the power of money and the power of power in business. And you only have to look at some of the scandals we've had in South Africa, especially with some of the big consulting firms, Bain, McKinsey, and that sort of stuff, who probably give talks and courses on ethics all the time, but the next day they sniff some real money in SARS or Eskom or Transnet or something like that, and all that goes out the window, and they chase the money. Tony Leon, once heard a quote from me, said, "Business has never met a government it doesn't like," and that's because in the end, business has to say, well, what's the new sheriff on the block here? How do we deal with him? And how are we going to survive and everything? So at some level, they have to make an accommodation, but they're scared of their allegiance is otherwise. But so and in the church, your allegiance is to God and the values of kingdom. And I think Christianity challenges holds that model together better than, say, Buddhism, which I don't think is a real threat to government and power, or Hinduism. I don't think that's a real threat to government and power. Islam is another story, and Islam, we get into theocracies and so on. So the church cannot and must not usher in the kingdom through political means. And in the Bible and biblically, we see examples of that. Jesus in the desert, when he was offered dominion by the devil, he resisted it. Jesus, when he was shown the coin, and he looked at it, Caesar was on one side, the high priestess, which was Tiberius's mother, was on the other side. And the implication was you worship Caesar. And he said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and he did not mention and God unto God. In other words, you worship God, you render unto Caesar your taxes, whatever else you have to do. And then Pilate, Jesus said to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. But this is the church's most consistent heresy. Take the Crusaders, for example. And just as a little illustration, there's some lines from a poem by William Blake. I will not cease from mental flight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hands, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. Right, that's ushering in. And whether that's, I'd have to know more to know whether that's a critique or an exhortation. But I think it was an exhortation. And you remember, Jerusalem in our minds is all sorts of things. In Nazi Germany, Jerusalem didn't include the Jews and all the people that he didn't like. And in the mind of social reformers, Jerusalem is peace in every suburb. But anyway, if we believe, and final note on this, if we believe that the kingdom of heaven can be established by political and economic means, then we cannot object to the claims of such a state to embrace the whole of life and to demand the total submission of the individual's will and conscience. So if we want it that way, we get what comes with it. And I just want to make a comment on the issue of authority, because some Christians refer to Romans 13, where it says submit to the authority of the state because it's God ordained, and this is very pervasive. And therefore, anyone who's a leader, you cut him some slack because he's ordained. Well, we must submit to the institution of the state, but the state is called to be good and just, and all the things I mentioned. So doesn't mean you have to obey it all the time, but where you don't obey it, because you submit to the institution of state, you will take the consequences. You will go to prison. You will feel this. You will face the consequences. I mean, take those brave people who conscientiously objected. They submitted to the consequences thereof. They went to prison. And the examples in the Bible of this, where Daniel didn't submit, Peter and Paul didn't submit, people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer took the consequences of his stand back in Nazi Germany, and so on. All right, so we come to church and state in the USA, and how did they model it? Because in many ways they got it right. And it's become problematic in recent times. But since Constantine, adopted the Christian religion, and he may have had some genuine conversion about that, but he also adopted it as the religion of the state. We've gone through a long period of city-states and conflation of church and state, and Holy Roman Empire, wars of religion in the Reformation era, wars of religion against the Muslims and the Muslims against the Christians, etc., etc. So now we have the colonists going across to America, where they were exiles from religious persecution, Pilgrim Fathers. And they established 13 colonies, and some of them had state religions. Come the War of Independence from 1775 to 1783, and the drafting of the Constitution after that by Adams and Jefferson and Madison and co. The founding fathers. Now, the Constitution came out in 1787, 4 years after the War of Independence completed, and it's a secular document. There's no mention of God in the American Constitution. Later, in 1954, with this rise of a sort of church, anyway, in 1954, in the national motto, they do say, "In God we trust," and in the oath of allegiance, one nation under God. So it creeps in there, but it's not in the Constitution. And in the First Amendment of the Constitution, which gives freedom of religion, speech, press, freedom of religion, speech, press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of petition, the Article 6 sub 3 of the First Amendment says that you cannot give someone a religious test to qualify for office. In other words, you can't say, here's the office as governor of this or judge of that, but are you a Christian? You can't do that. And so why was this? Because the founding fathers were very wary of religious persecution. That come from that. America had been started on that. Obviously, there were a lot of people in America before the whites came. And so 100 years later, Abe Lincoln said, the beauty of the American Constitution is everyone is free to worship under their own tree. And for people like the Jews, that was massively significant because they had, throughout history, had to make an accommodation with whoever was in power and then get persecuted again and have to flee and all sorts of things. So to be told that they had their own tree to worship under was big. And the other thing they're worried about in terms of religious persecution, if you made a Christian state, well, sooner or later it's going to become one sect of a Christian state, so you get all sorts of dangers ahead. So there was no state religion. Interestingly, each state in America, each of the 50 states has its own little constitution, and they all mention God. So it's the federal constitution that doesn't. So by refusing to assign redemptive power to the state or allow coercive power to the church, the American experiment separated these two institutions for their first time since Constantine. Now, I know France also did something, but France came to sort of their first stage was really let's worship man instead, or leave church out of it, and the French Revolution and glory to man. But the rider to that type of model, as John Adams wrote in 1798, I think John Adams was the second president. We have no government armed in power, in other words, got power, capable of contending with human passions that are unbridled by morality or religion. Our constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. So it makes an assumption about where people are coming from. And I think, there's a lot in that, what's the alternative, some sort of fascist government. So the modern era, what have we seen in terms of the separation of church and state? We've seen a rise recently in the Kingdom Plus through political forces, and this is the sort of start of Christian nationalism, where the religious right, often fueled by the wealthy. I forgot to say in that story that I told you up front, Israel had been given a lot of funding, and this far right little splinter group had been given funding. One of it by the oil barons, and so why? Because they don't mind a bit of chaos in the Middle East because it drives the oil price down. So the religious right. So we get basically a start of tribal politics and tribal politics is a lot about tribal politics. But becoming an on-ramp for Christianity. And we get the rise of the politically aligned evangelists in the 70s, huge movement. Eisenhower had started the National Day of Prayer, National Prayer Breakfast, which they still have, which I think you've got to treat very carefully on if you're a Christian church. Jerry Falwell Sr., he was very much behind Reagan coming in 1984. It was almost this story I told you, this referendum on God. when Reagan came in, and he was anointed by Jerry Falwell. And roll forward now, who anointed Trump? But Franklin Graham, the son of. And it is so wrong for the Christians to get involved with anointing political power. And they called out Trump as now the new Cyrus, you are instrument, and all that sort of stuff. We are not Old Testament prophets who were ordained by God to do that sort of stuff. We are not, and that time has passed. The movements, as I mentioned, the moral majority. Some people mention the focus on the family, and now I'm not saying all these were all bad, but this is the wave. There was a huge thing in the 1780s, which I've been listening to a series of. They call the Satanic Panic. We saw Satan behind everything, in tattoos, in crystal balls, in backtrack music, and they're also using Satan wants to nail the US because the USA has got a divine purpose. And there was a lot of interpretation which were otherwise just plain evil stuff, plain personal evil, and into these bigger agendas. So we had the rise of the mega churches, which often, let me not say that all about all the mega churches, but you can be biblical without being Christ-like, all right? So less tolerance for pluralism, and nationalism started to trump Christianity, true Christianity. And the church, so politicians started to use the church to legitimize them, and the church started to use the politicians for access to power. All right. So we have, and this wasn't just in America. We'd seen what happened under Nazi Germany, where the Nazis controlled the church. In the USSR, they started to abolish the church. In South Africa, we know the conflation of church and government that happened here. The abuse of the Bible in calling people only hewers of wood and stuff like that, which the church justified apartheid. And then and China, still now oppresses the church. They have the government church in China, which apparently got sort of 80 million people, but it's sort of government sanctioned. And then there's the huge underground church, which was much more real. In Hungary, Viktor Orban uses the church to legitimize his fascist state right now. He's been in power since 2010 or 2014. Then in Brazil, this Jair Bolsonaro, who was popped out of power in late 23. In late 22, and in January 23, tried to overthrow government through a military coup. And he rode a huge evangelical wave. About a third of the voters were in this evangelical wave who he had under his thumb. And they wanted him for power, and he wanted them for legitimacy and votes. And in January 23, within a month after not winning the election, he organized a massive, like Jan 6 for Trump back in 20. He took a leaf from that, and there was a massive invasion of government buildings, destruction, etc., which actually looked like Trump's invasion earlier, like a Tea Party. We don't know. I mean, I speak for myself, but I knew about it, but I didn't realize how big it was. Anyway, he's now met his comeuppance, despite Trump's objections, because Trump likes a lot of these guys, right? So on to Christian nationalism in the USA, and how would you really define Christian nationalism? And crudely, it's a modern day version of the Crusaders. It's a means to power, slaughter the Saracens. I've always been interested that one of the big rugby teams in England is called the Saracens, but nevertheless, adopt Christianity as a way to get ahead, as opposed to adopt Christianity because you believe in its truth. And it may cost you. This is not something as a means to glory. Christian nationalism holds that the US, and this is very much in the narrative now, the US was founded as a strictly Christian nation, which it wasn't, right? Congress should be consistent with Scripture. Presidents would all be believers and would consult the Bible before taking any action. And this is where the article I read, which used some of these words, use the term the Taliban of Christians, all right? So country over all, country over Christ. And this has come at fertile ground. There's fertile ground for this rise because rural America has become adrift, like a lot of rural communities around the world where agriculture is consolidated, industries consolidated in the bigger towns. They've become adrift, marginalized, resentful. There's fertile ground there for politicians to exploit. The demographics of America are changing. They're white majority now, but that's going to change. Within the next 10, 15 years, they're no longer white majority. The Hispanics, blacks, and others will outnumber them. The actual number of people who identify as Christians is dropping. There's been deindustrialization. China's eaten their lunch, all right? And the men in particular are struggling with this, and Trump rides on that. He says they feel real jobs. You guys are wussies now. You're not making cars anymore. You are, but you're not making enough, and you're not dealing in the proper factories and so on. And so we get a victimhood, especially of young white men who feel they've lost privilege. They're angry at corruption as if it only affects them, and that can apply to this country too. They're sucked into all sorts of conspiracy theories. There's the loss of academic powers because girls are now out competing them massively, which is terribly inconvenient. Because they're doing it here also. And women's empowerment is threatening their manhood. That's why there's this movement to we need trad wives back, traditional wives who are not in your face. They're happy to be a mum and they can have a tiny little career, maybe a little craft or something. But so and then we had the woke pendulum had swung too far, and it's now swinging backwards to the other side too far. But DEI had swung too far. And for example, there was Trump picked on this flight controller issue, and there was a very real issue. It was very difficult for a white person, especially a white man, to become a flight air traffic controller. They had all sorts of tests which basically excluded you. And so there was stuff that needed correction there. But to throw out all of DEI, DEI came into America for very good reasons. After the Civil Liberties Act in 1964, the American South did not want to listen to any of that. No, that's not for us. In fact, the South has resisted even when slavery was abolished. They didn't want to obey that. So there's been massive racist momentum in the South America, still is. And so DEI was brought in to say you will cut some slack to minorities and blacks and so on, and it's still necessary. But it's the center you have to find on these matters, not the swing. Compulsory pronouns, the trans athletes competing. Yeah, he's got a good point about why should someone who's built like this and 6'6" compete in the women's swimming, And the operations too young, where the people were able to get gender reassignment operations in their early teens, and this happened in the NHS also in England. Critical race theory and overdoing it, going too far. But don't dismiss the validity of some of the core things about critical race theory. It's got some good things to say also. Humanities, who would want to study humanities? Gone too far. The cancelling and deplatforming of anyone that you don't like and stuff. So that cancelled, a lot of the right-wing guys. So now we're cancelling a lot of left-wing guys, right? So the pendulum has swung, all right? We demonize anyone who's trans, all right? And in America, there's a word, I didn't write it down, but it's something like trans demonization or something. And remember that guy who walked into the Catholic Church and killed 13 little people? He was a person transitioning. So there's now made out that there's this whole spiritual thing attached to trans, and it's a whole thing like that. Meanwhile, it's a confused youngster, and one of the things he was confused about was his trans, but he confused about all sorts of things. I don't say he was confused about being trans, but they picked on that, where he was a disturbed youngster with all sorts of other stuff written in his books and about all sorts of other killers and stuff. Just as an aside, in India, there's a transgender caste, And, it can't be a popular place to belong to because it's right near the bottom of the pecking order where the only work you're assigned is cleaning toilets or something. And, but they call the HIJRA, Hijra or whatever, and it's there. Now, I can't see that it's a popular or an easy move for someone to say, gee, I am actually transgender, I'm going to go and move this class, because there's no kudos in it. But it's there and it's survived for ages. So don't just dismiss the fact that there can be people who are genuinely trans so Trump exploits the pendulum is swung. I'm talking about Trump exploits tribal grievances. He's revising the whole Smithsonian history to whitewash slavery, the military history. He's taking people out of the records who were black generals and stuff like that to expunge them. He's defunding education and research. Actually, I'll come back to that later. There's a rise of what they call Seven Mountains Dominionism. This is control, power of fundamental Christianity, where you take over society, the family, the government, all the seven mountains of society: family, government, media, education, art, entertainment, business. I'll say it because I'm going to come to it. Doesn't mean you mustn't be involved in those things, but dominion of it is another story. And we have a Christian nation and all the spiritual wars construct about that. And if you frame reality in that way, in a way that would justify Donald DJT's campaign, sorry, let me say it again. If you frame reality in that way, it would justify DJT's campaign for fascist power. Anything goes. So, one little symbol of that. One of the people at the January 6th invasion of the federal whatever was someone wearing a Jesus cap with MAGA written. So there's also the feeling, and I've got a couple of friends like this who feel this whole thing is a revolution of good stuff because it's anti-work, it's pro-family, it's pro he and she, it's pro calling out evil, and only Christians can really be trusted, and so on. And that's where he sees it's good, and therefore he's cutting all sorts of slack. He doesn't want to see the lack of fruit in government or lack of fruit in people. So Trump understands the power of religion in his own political place, which explains why he plays the movement. And he's appointed lots of players who come from this movement, and he uses gospelly language well. I'm hoping I'm going to finish in 10 minutes. I will, I think. So we have people like Charlie Kirk, rest in peace. But he did some good stuff, and he engaged with people, and he opened the debate. But he did talk a lot about racial supremacy. He denigrates blacks. He denigrated people like Martin Luther King. He denigrated women, and he wanted a theocracy. So go figure. Stephen Miller is the deputy chief of staff in the US. There's this woman, Wiles, who's the chief of staff. She's sort of more below the radar. Stephen Miller is probably one of the most powerful people in the administration, not probably is. And he is a complete Christian nationalist. He talks about Christendom as empire. And we in this group have the fire to save the civilization. We are on the side of God. And when he says we, he's talking about the white we, all right, in America, the European descent, not all these immigrants. And remember that they're also immigrants. All the white people in America, immigrants too. We are on the side of God. He uses a we are light, we are beauty, we are goodness, we are virtue. We can build, we can create. Versus them, all right? And they are nothing. This is quote. This is a pure quote. They are nothing. They are evil. They cannot create. They are destruction, etc. So it's very othering language. And we have people like and Stephen Miller hates immigrants, right? He grew up on the west coast of California, down south, which has got a lot of immigrants, a lot of Hispanic people and stuff. And from a schoolboy, he has hated immigrants, and it's now coming out. J.D. Vance, who's under the spell of Peter Thiel, who's the founder of Palantir, is one of the big tech bros. Peter Thiel is under the influence of a guy called Carl Schmitt, who's a Nazi writer, Nazi sympathizer. And Peter Thiel, he decided that the Antichrist is already here, and it's Antifa. Antifa are all enemies of Trump, right? It's a loose association. Doesn't exist. It's got no email address. But that's where Peter Thiel's coming across. And he doesn't believe in democracy. No, it's the elite, the most smart people and people with a bit of ammo. They must rule. You guys stay out the way. And there's a lot of that pervasive. Some of it a bit quietly below the surface, but a lot of the tech bro type of people think that actually they deserve more oxygen and they should rule. There's Russell Vought, he's the budget czar now. He was in the Heritage Foundation and he was one of the main drafters of what they call Project 25, based on Hungary, by the way, to how to bring about a fascist state, which is the playbook they've been following. And he's a big white Christian nationalist. Christian Noam, Homeland Security, big white Christian nationalist. Some of them have Christian stories. And so I don't want to comment on whether they, in the end, whether they get down on their knees and they believe in God. And but in the Christian nationalism, in my mind, they've become warped. Pete Hegseth is under the influence of a very strong right-wing theocracy supporting pastor. There's a CI lady, Ratcliffe. And then, we have the evangelists who are behind this sort of stuff, people like Jerry Falwell, Doug Wilson, Robert Jeffries, Steve Bannon, another one. Steve Bannon was Trump's advisor in the first thing, and now he's sort of the right-wing think tank type of guy. He believes in racial purity, and he says Trump has been divinely infused to do his job. Steve Bannon, when he first came across Christ, there's a story that he tells himself. Before the 2016 election, he said, no, one of his mates, and he was down south in his right-wing think tank, and called him and said, look, I want you to come up and help me interview someone. I think it's potential candidate for a Republican nominee for the 16 elections. And he said, who is it? And it's Donald Trump. Oh, no, he's an idiot. Whatever you want to deal with him for. No, just come anyway. Come and interview. So, okay. And Trump comes into the room and says, big guy, he's got a good presence. That's always useful. And then they have a chat with him. And they said, Mr. Trump, there are two things that are a problem. One, do you know that you've got to be pro-life? No Republican president has ever got elected unless he's pro-life. So Trump says, what's pro-life? All right. So they explained to him. So Trump thinks, but he said, no, I can do that, right? Then they said, and Trump, it's a problem that you have been funding Democrats in various towns around the country, and funding the mayors. No, I've never done that. Why would I do that? And so they bring out some records, boom, 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 boom. They show him. Oh, Dad, got me there. Yes, I have. But they're all pinko left Democrat mayors, and I'm in real estate and have to deal with them. So that's why I have to give them money. And then after he's gone, Steve Bannon and this other guy look at each other and say, I think we could deal with this guy. He's sufficiently flexible. And so now let's look at, in any of these movements, you must look at the fruit. And as Christians, we should look at the fruit. So, and I won't try and go through all this list, and it could be 6 times long, but in terms of what we should look at the Christians is, how are you dealing with immigrants? They are terrorized there. ICE, DHS, dehumanized, demonized. They are incarcerated in prisons like Alligator Alcatraz down in the swamplands in Alabama or something like that, and in CCAP in El Salvador, where they're on unhuman conditions. In the Alligator Alcatraz, which is a place they built, they're on wire cages with zoos in there, which are as white as the same thing as their drinkable water. They are 24/7 in lights. They are not allowed out. It is quite disgusting. And Kirsty Noam and couple go and pose in front of them, So and then in CCAP, where they're all these guys were exported, 90% of which had no criminal charges against them at all. In El Salvador, similar conditions, tortured all the time. He's currently picking on the Ethiopians in Minneapolis. There are about 100,000 Ethiopians in Minneapolis. Somalians in Minneapolis, 100,000, of which 50,000 were born in the USA, 95% of which have got US citizenship, and he's picking on them as an easy target. And he's going to send his ICE and DHS people. And they are terrified at the moment. And then, this thing about open borders and people just riding through in the bus is absolute myth. But there was a system, and in fact, there were less people coming into the USA at the end of Biden's administration and the end of Trump's first administration. What he's done now is just close it down. He's made it impossible to even apply. So people, and they're also terrified of what they see behind the fence. So people can't, and there are people in the States that have lived there for 17, 18 years. They've gone every year to try and progress their immigration application, and they get stonewalled. They just get another year because the systems, especially in the South, are so anti them getting anywhere. So there's a lot to this immigration story that we don't see. And remember, most of immigrants are productive. The farm sector runs in the 42%. The farmers are turning against Trump because they've lost a lot of labor. The construction sector, the hospitality sector, all sorts of. And remember, the second generation of immigrants become professionals around the world. So what is happening with us is disgusting. In my mind, and I don't want to get in the debate, but he's given a free pass to Putin and Netanyahu, where we've seen untold misery unleashed. He's collapsed USAID, which if you're full of money and everything, you should be generous, at an individual level and at a state level. Well, he collapsed USAID, which was less than 1% of their budget, which is a whole lot of good work to marginalized and poor people around the world. And now people are starving as a result of that. And the poor in the USA, he's against food stamps, which are not just for lazy people, as he said. They are for cripples and all sorts of people who actually can't afford to put enough food on the table. Medical insurance tax credits, he wants to undo Obamacare, which will affect a whole lot of people who on the edge have been able to get into the medical system. He's weaponizing justice. Joseph Stalin used the phrase, "You show me the man and I'll show you the crime." He's denying the germ theory of disease with his Robert Kennedy cuckoo guy. He's enriching the elite with tax cuts, foreign policy deals, and his family is enriching. He's pardoning sins, all sorts of sins of powerful and technical, his mates and other people. I mean, he says he's against drugs in Venezuela. He's just pardoned the ex-president of Honduras, who was sentenced to 50 years in prison by an American court for dealing in drugs. 400 tons of cocaine into the US, guilty as sin, just pardoned him. So go figure. Mar-a-Lago, building this big palace next to the White House for conference center and whatever. I heard it described as decorated in demagogue chic. This guy, to quote that phrase, has seen these things all around the world. He says they're all the same. Anyways, Mar-a-Lago North. He threatens congressmen who called him out on illegal orders or the potential for illegal orders, threatened him with death. I won't talk about his terrorists. RSA refugees, the only refugees he wants are 7,500 from RSA. Why? Because that suits his white narrative. He says the blacks there made it so bad that look at the blacks, that we'll have these white guys who've been persecuted and killed and all that sort of stuff. What is he like himself? Well, in my mind, he just spews ad hominem against the person. He hatred, othering, evil, enemy. And that sort of talk unleashes the radicals. That gives people permission to act and kill people and do all that. He's vindictive, he's vengeful, he belittles people all the time, he insults people. He's vain beyond the thinking thereof. His ego, hubris. He dresses himself on these memes, these memes in empress clothes with a crown on and stuff like that, and then flying a plane over Democrat cities, which he doesn't like, dropping shit on them. I mean, this is it's madness. He wears a cap that says Trump is right about everything, or is always right about everything. He's a stranger to the truth. He doesn't care about anything. He lies. He stopped 8 wars, for example. He admires dictators. The Gulf Petro guys are his buddies because their church and family are the same thing. The French have got an expression which Louis XIV apparently coined, or people, hypothetically, or they coined it about him. And it's spelled l'état, c'est moi, c'est moi, but it's pronounced l'état c'est moi, and which means basically the state is me, right? So if you want to get into Trump's mind, the state is me, l'état c'est moi. All right, last page, and I'll be 2 minutes. So what is our response to this? And basically, as Charles Colton says, as Christians, we mustn't absent ourselves from the world. We mustn't withdraw. We must get involved. there are many things the church and individuals have done in terms of social justice, poor prisons, education, all sorts of things around the world. Wonderful stuff. But we must get involved in the contestation. Because in many of these debates, the center has been lost. We're becoming polarized, so enter the debate. You can become a politician. Carlson comments dryly towards the end of his book. He said, Christians can go into politics, but it's difficult for them to do well. And I found that myself. I've got a personal story about that, where I found it difficult as a person to deal with the allegiance they want, the allegiance the party wants about everything, the lies that are told, the exaggerations, the games that are played, the lack of creative, constructive engagement, etc. It becomes difficult. But at a church level, what is a church must do is confront injustice. And I admire the Catholic, I admire the Pope for talking out against what's happening, and Pope Leo XIV. And the US bishops have also, Catholic bishops have also written a critical letter. I don't know, I don't see the evangelicals, I don't see the Anglicans, do not anoint politicians. The church must model values and out of love. Don't shout. So, on pro-life, church can be pro-life. I'm pro-life, but it's difficult to shout at people about an opposition or go and burn down places. And remember, pro-life is not just pro-life for the unborn; it's pro-life for the born. It was modeled that all folk are equal, break down racial and structural strata in our church. We've helped the poor, and the history of church demonstrates a lot of good stuff about this, but don't go wrong on it. At an individual level, we must disband the notion that Christians have the monopoly on wisdom, governance, geopolitics, and therefore we must trust only Christians. We do not have the monopoly. We maybe have the monopoly of knowing, we do have the monopoly of knowing who the Savior is, and it gives us a different type of wisdom. It gives us wisdom in the world, that we know that we know what our identity is, and that is a wisdom which I think is unique, but not being a better commentator on geopolitics. We may be, but we don't have, and so people, so don't interpret God's agenda. Job and his friends tried to interpret God's agenda, especially his friends. Don't interpret it. God in the instance of Job, you said, I'm God, you're not, and I will do what I will do. So when it comes to Gaza, for example, some people I've spoken to feel that, well, this is a biblical thing because we're finishing what Joshua didn't finish. We're finishing that work. Nonsense, all right? We must call out evil in real time. Or we give ourselves an excuse for passivity. Oh, we mustn't call this out because we're cutting some slack because he's doing God's agenda. Not true. Conspiracy theories, I feel we must avoid. We must be salt, light, and fruit. That's our command. And the fruit is for others. Yes, the fruit of must be in our own self in terms of love, kindness, and patience, and all those things. But the fruit we produce is for others. It's for fruit is on a vine. It's for other people to pluck. So the fruit you can produce in the world is for others. The commandment we're given is love the Lord with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself, and that is what we must do. And we're not going to get it right. So we can get it and we fail. So repent, believe, receive, and grow, and receive grace and grow, and do it again and again. And if we don't do things like that, and we don't call out the horrors of what they're doing to the immigrants and stuff like that, when we start telling people about Jesus and stuff, some of the people, the humanists and stuff, who are calling out those horrors, will say, well, we're not so interested in your Jesus, and that's it. Sorry, I've taken just about all the time.
Okay, can I do facilitators of use and ask the first question?
Yeah.
So I just want to be sure what you did and didn't do. I mean, all your I mean, you called it a rant, right?
Yeah, it was a rant.
Wasn't a case in point of, oops, this is why church and state can't mix, right? It was actually a case in point of a facade Christianity got into the state, and that's problematic. But for us to bring our, I don't know, our true convictions into that sort of, well, into
the public square, into the public
is important. Okay, so how do we love neighbor? We will have different values. Some values will not even include love neighbor. So one of the objectives, I think, of state is also, a state can't love. You can't legislate love, but the state can possibly provide the kind of environment in which love is possible, and it's responsible for that.
And that's
are we on the same page?
Yeah, I'm completely on the same page, and that's where Christians must get involved with things of the state and enabling that sort of stuff. So even take something hard like abortion, and we say, all right, don't like abortion, but let's say there's a vote on a law which will make abortion a bit harder to get and a bit more thoughtful and stuff like that. I don't think you should absent yourself and say there should only be ever no abortion. Therefore, I'm not going to vote on that law because it's still saying, oh, well, you can have abortion if it's a bit more thoughtful, a bit more stuff. It's still abortion. Yes, it is. But I would still vote for it because it's better than what there was, So, but there, on all the matters of what the state must do, which is to be just and fair and help the poor and stuff, we must get involved. But remember, there are Christians in all political parties. So there's this idea that the only Christians in government are in the ACDP. That's a lot of nonsense. So it's difficult when we argue about isms and stuff. But I totally. Carlson says, get involved with the public square.
Okay. So you were going for this. Let me see what the other hands are. So can we do? Oh my goodness. Okay. So we're going to go slightly over just because it's the last one. Those 4 hands that we see. Try be briefer than I was. So
you're both brief.
No, sure. So thank you very much. A lot to think about. So we confuse religion with a walk with God.
Yes.
And I like to think in my life it's very much the same thing, but it probably isn't. And in many cases, it's absolutely not the same. Everybody serves something, whether God is in it, whether it's Jesus in it. Everybody has a religion of sorts. So coming back to this sort of evangelical and what we see is the test, and somebody can help you with the exact reference, but in the Epistle of John, the fear versus love.
Fear versus love.
Yes, and you touched on the love part of it, but their currency is fear. That's what they do. They sell fear, and unfortunately, all of these guys who seek power.
These guys you're ranting around.
Yes, they sell fear. Fear sells very well. Politicians sell fear. Love doesn't sell as well. Love doesn't get you elected and all that sort of thing. But that for me is the test.
But Christians should model love.
Absolutely.
No, I totally agree with what you say.
Okay.
So just firstly, thanks Anthony for the comment. I was interested that you say that the church shouldn't shout, but I think of someone like Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I was greatly encouraged by what the Catholic bishops did, and I kind of felt like it was
But the Catholic bishops
in the States, speaking out against the anti-immigration movement, and it felt like a little too little, too late. But I guess it's more of a comment, just that I believe the church is called to be a prophetic voice.
Yes.
So to call out injustice, and that's what Tutu did, and it's kind of like where is the prophetic voice today? And I think we have been challenged about that in various TGIF meetings, but so just to comment.
I totally agree. And I mean, where I said what is the role of the church is to model the kingdom and exhibit it, and to call out on social injustice. And so, but I think our voice has been that. And I don't. Tutu, did he shout? He also modeled love. And so
So when I was at Bible college, I had a lecturer who was going to write a paper. I don't know if he ever did, titled "Jesus, Our Genocidal Warrior," but his focus was on genocide of the Old Testament and how God told people to wipe out nations. And so I think to come with
you're getting into difficult territory.
Well, if you look at Christian nationalism, it's very easy to take some of the hard stuff the Bible says and misinterpret it and misapply it. And where I see a weakness in the church today, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, is a lack of maybe direction and leadership or quietness. I think one of the things that we need is good teaching and good leadership. And to sum that up, one word, it would be shepherding. And perhaps what we need is shepherding with integrity. And maybe we need to see more of that.
Look, I think on genocide, love, I'm no expert on this, but I think those things had their context in the Old Testament on specific instructions and for specific reasons. But that does not translate to now, you know. And otherwise, I agree with you. And even the concept of Israel, you know, how much should we regard Israel now as Christ and believers as opposed to with geography and nationalism?
Yeah. So I mean, just a comment on the Minnesota story.
Yeah.
I don't think they're anti-Somali. What is happening there? And I saw a little thing by Army Horowitz where he interviewed Somalis in America, born in America, asking them, "Are you Somali or American?" And without fail, all of them say, the ones he interviewed, and there were quite a few, no, we Somali. And he asked him, where would you like to stay, America or Somalia? No, probably Somalia. Do you prefer Sharia or American law? No, Sharia, because we're Muslim. And so the problem is not their skin color or even their ethnicity or anything like that. It's that they don't assimilate. That's the main problem. And so the same as Zohran Mamdani now, who's the mayor of New York, the problem with Islam is it's a lying religion. I'm sorry to say, but they part of their game is to lie to people so that they can gain your confidence. I don't trust Zohran Mamdani at all. And so this is the game they play. And again, so I don't think it's a skin color issue. I think it's assimilation. That's the main problem.
Yeah. Okay. Look, I think there's probably a bit of two sides to that. You know, you never know how some of these interviews are set up. So I don't always trust them all. And you know, the Somalians, the mayor of Minneapolis said a whole lot of Somalians are serving in the police force of Minneapolis. You know, and you know they've got jobs there. I don't want to get in the whole Islam debate. I think Mandani is going to surprise on the upside big time, you know. But yes, I do agree that assimilation should happen more. But what I will say is those Somalians that are there in Minneapolis are a constructive, engaged community who are working and who are providing employment and are contributing to the economy. Maybe they're to us, but you know, take the Greeks that came to Joburg, they lived as their own community, and the Italians and stuff, and over time assimilate more.
I'm always thinking about how does really affect us here in South Africa, and unfortunately it does, because I think one of the big challenges about America and about Trump is that he has an effect on us.
He does.
And I think what you said really covers our sort of response that is grounded in our faith, in love, in a general way. But I think we also need to think about specific responses in South Africa to the fallout that's coming as a result of what Trump has done. And
give us an example of what you think.
Well, the one thing that I noticed is that right in the beginning when the refugee thing happened, I happened to be in a shop where a white woman was speaking to the black woman who was serving her, and she entered into a conversation about how disgusting it was, and she does not stand for that. She was on the bottom. And I think those kinds of conversations need to actually happen. And I thought that was great. No,
I totally agree. I mean, I don't think we have the luxury of saying this is happening in America, it's not happening here. Other than just for what is happening, it's also because Trump and this whole movement are leaders of the most powerful economy in the world, and they don't just affect themselves; they've affected the whole world. You know, and so I agree with you. We can't put our head under the sand and say this is not my problem.
And I think it would be good to actually think about practical things that we can do.
Well, so you can give us a talk next year. Well.
How in South Africa do we address the issue of immigration? And the fact that there's so much xenophobia in this country.
So we have to do that.
So what do we do here?
It's an issue. It's an issue. Look, it's an issue everywhere. And immigration has always been and the developed world needs immigrants. I mean, no one. I watched a TV documentary a few years ago, 4 years ago or so, and it was in America, in Idaho or something, in the sort of badlands, the flat, windswept grassland, and they interviewed an abattoir owner. He was a pork abattoir owner, and then they interviewed a dairy farmer, and it was about immigration. And the abattoir owner was employing mainly Mexicans. So they went to him and said, "Why are you employing all these Mexicans?" And he said, "Well, I try and employ the American youth, but they don't last." He said, "No, American youth don't want to cut the bung, that's the backside, the bunghole out of a porker." And then they interviewed the dairy farmer, and he said, "Why?" And he said, "I try Americans, but after a week they come to me and say, 'Sir, this getting up at 4 in the morning is like not for me,' And so he says, 'What do I do?' And I've got an American friend who was South African, but he's lived in America for about 20 years now, and he says to him, other than all the politics and everything, the biggest problem of America now is drug addiction, in the youth especially, and sports gambling addiction. And he said it is taking the guts out of America.
So you told Vera there's a part 2. We can also bounce it back to you. So just to sort of, I think there would be a part 2 to struggle a little bit more deeply with the issues that we face in our own country. One of the comments on Zoom was that Christian nationalism was the ruling ideology from 1948 to 1994. And we now, we got into the discussion around Islam, we got into the discussion around immigration. I think there's a lot of places we can potentially still go with that. Sure. Anthony, thank you. And all participants in the room and on Zoom, thank you.